if there's a wizarding world, is there wizarding communism? Was there a wizarding civil rights movement? Is there wizarding nationalism? Is wizarding China currently oppressing the wizarding Uyghurs? Now, obviously, J.K. Rowling didn't think about any of that because it's a children's series, so why would she? But I don't care. Basically, she made the world. It's an interesting world, and I'm now going to chat shit about it. So, this is actually the second Harry Potter episode on Polymath. So, in episode 3, I talked about the macroeconomics of the Harry Potter world. And the funny thing is, I think something which I should just get out of the way, I don't even really give a shit about Harry Potter. I don't, it's okay. It's alright, it's a cool franchise, the movies are enjoyable, the books were good, I read the books when I was in year 5, it was fun, it was a good bit of crack, but I don't really, it's not that deep. But what I really care about, what I actually do think is deep, are real academic disciplines. I really do care about political science and psychology and economics and sociology and anthropology and history. And so Polymath is a podcast which reflects that interest. It's a lot of it's about social sciences, really. Although that's not set in stone. I don't want to say it's a social sciences podcast because I do have interests outside it and I want to make episodes on those interests in the future. But you'll notice that these are the kind of fields which I really care about, which I want to talk to you about, which I want to yap about. But what I find really interesting is when we can apply these sciences to fictional worlds. We take a world, such as J.K. Rowling's built world of the Harry Potter universe, and we take this rich source of fantasy. Because I love that as well. I love stories and tales. I mean, that's why I really like history, because history is it's just the greatest story of all time, isn't it? It's just the biggest and best one. So I love reading. I've always been a huge fiction enjoyer, and I've always really appreciated the world building in fiction. So just an example of what world building is. So when Tolkien wrote wrote Lord of the Rings, before he wrote the story, he made the fictional world that it was set in. So he made Middle-earth as its conceptually distinct entity before writing the story of the Lord of the Rings. So that's world building. It's the creation of that world. And I love world building. I've done it myself. I've done it loads of times. I've been doing it since I was 13 in lots of different world building projects. And I love fiction with good world building. Now, the Harry Potter world building, as we explored episode 3, isn't good in the sense of quality, but it's interesting. It's an engaging world that you'd want to talk about. That grabs people. And it has grabbed people. I mean, Harry Potter's massive. So what I love is applying these social sciences, is applying genuine academic thought in politics, psychology, economics, etc., to these fictional worlds. And obviously fictional worlds aren't designed with these in mind. Tolkien drew on loads and loads of real academic data for his world building, so it's of a very high quality. But most of the time when a fictional world is created for a story, it's not really designed with that in mind. So the world building is usually quite unrealistic, apart from, as I said, Lord of the Rings, and also the Dune series, which is great. But they're interesting. And I'm not really massively into fantasy. I'm not really hugely into Lord of the Rings or Star Trek or Star Wars. I haven't even seen Star Wars or Star Trek. Or Lord of the Rings, actually, apart from little bits. I tried watching Star Wars. I tried watching the episode, I think episode 4. And it opened with the golden dickhead, running, C-3PO running down a corridor. And he was just saying stuff. And I was just thinking, I don't care. I don't care about any of this. I want to be doing something else. So I did. I'm watching any Star Wars. So I'm not really into fantasy. But I know a lot about, first of all, the Pokemon world. Because I was massively into Pokemon as a kid. I had loads of the Pokemon games. And it was quite a big part of my childhood. So I looked up a lot of information about the Pokemon world because I was very interested in it. And there's going to be episodes. We are going to do episodes on the Pokemon world in the future. But I also know about the Harry Potter world because it's an interesting world to me. It doesn't have a huge personal resonance in the way that Pokemon does, but it's interesting. So about this time last year, I think, about that... Ooh, weird voice crack there. That's interesting. I haven't really had that since year 10. That's a bit of reverse puberty for you there. But... bro, Harry Potter's de-aging me. It's taken me back to my year 5 self. But anyway, I rewrote Harry Potter about a year ago according to realistic principles. I took the Harry Potter world and I thought to myself, if we applied actual academic disciplines, if we applied genuine fact here, if we look at the social sciences and we apply insights from these to the Harry Potter world, how can we shape this world so we keep the richness of that world, the fantasy storybook element, that magic, that kind of enchanted fantasy of it, the richness of that original source. If we combine that with the social sciences and we use that to generate a realistic world, that's something that I was very interested in. That's what I was trying to do. So I rewrote the Harry Potter series essentially just for shits and giggles. I mean, I should have been doing my degree. I was doing medicine at the time. I'm now integrating. I'm doing psychology for a year, which is really fun. But the story itself is going to be another episode. So I think that's going to be the next episode. So you're going to be getting 2 Harry Potter episodes in a row. So if you give a shit about Harry Potter, that's great news for you. If you don't give a shit about Harry Potter, I mean, watch it anyway. It's probably still entertaining. I mean, I don't really give a shit about Harry Potter. I'm just sort of doing it for, I don't know, I guess for nerd-related reasons. Like, just to explore the social sciences, really. I guess virginity-related reasons is how you could describe it. But the story's going to be another episode. The actual world building, the actual world of Harry Potter, a realistic Harry Potter, is what I'm going to be talking about now. And I made a Word document for this. So I wrote down all my ideas into a Word document. And in this Word document, which I've titled Realistic Harry Potter, in very serious Times New Roman font, although I've noticed I've put the body of the text in Aptos Light. So there you go. Clearly, little Dan was thinking about the formatting of this document. I say little Dan. I was 20 at the time. Big Dan. Well, medium Dan. In the scale of a lifespan, still little Dan. I mean, if you're going to live to like 90. So little Dan, medium to little Dan, moderate Dan, you could say. Moderate Dan was thinking about formatting. But anyway, so I've written the premise, which is a dark 18-rated remake of the Harry Potter series with realistic, detailed, well-thought-out world building. A dark 18-rated remake. Yeah, I know. I was saying fuck off to myself when I was writing it, but it is true. That's the idea of it. The story revolves around economics and politics. Sociology, psychology, and history are major themes as well. The real focus of the narrative is political and cultural conflict, with Voldemort and the Death Eaters taking advantage of this to seize power. This was the crux of what I found interesting, because what I love is like the idea is like it would be a story which was true to the original richness and the charm and the magic of the Harry Potter world, but which reflected the real world at the time and which had something proper to say about it. And that interface, that conjunction between the fantasy and the real, that's what I fucking love. That's what I was very interesting about. So I've written some background about what the Wizarding World would look like. So I've written, the Wizarding World has remained hidden from the Muggle world for all of recorded history. The level of secrecy is varied, however, with legends like Merlin and periods like the 1600s witch hunting craze representing lapses in this secrecy. Which I think is necessary, because I think if the Muggle world knew about the Wizarding World, and here's the thing, so if you go on the Harry Potter wiki, and I was balls deep in the Harry Potter wiki when I was writing this document, because I wanted to know what the Harry Potter world was like. I needed to research the world. And it's so unrealistic. So in the Harry Potter wiki, it says in the actual Harry Potter world, the British Prime Minister is aware of the Wizarding World. That's fucking bullshit, right? Because if you told like David Cameron or Rishi Sunak or anyone, any Prime Minister, they would not keep that shit a secret. And also, if you told the British Prime Minister, if the government knew about the Wizarding World in any state, that would cause massive problems. Massive problems. I genuinely think if the CIA knew about wizards, they would kidnap some fucking wizard. They would, I don't know, knock him out with halothane or something. Because there's no magical immunity to gas poisoning. They'd knock him out, they'd put him in a room, and they'd start experimenting on them. There is no way the Muggle world would know about the Wizarding World and just let that slide. Just be completely chill with it. If the USA is willing to go to war because a country on the other side of the world, Vietnam, has gone communist, or is thinking about going communist, or if the USA is going to launch a coup in Latin America because one country is getting mildly left-wing, they are not going to allow a fucking magic wizarding society just to chill there. And obviously that principle applies to every government. I mean, it'd be worse in authoritarian regimes like China and Russia, where respect for human rights is even less. But yes, the CIA has a long history of meddling in shit and experimenting on its own people as well. I mean, just look up MK Ultra. And meddling in other countries. So Operation Gladio, for example, if you want a Western example. But again, I'm using the USA as an example. I believe that would generalize to every single country. The USA meddling in foreign affairs is not an example of a unique malice in the American character. Every country does that when they can. Every country has done that when they can. So that's what I'm trying to say. So currently, as I've written, in this realistic Harry Potter world, the Ministry of Magic would have zero contact with the British government. Fucking obviously. The British government cannot be, you would not, come on. Do you really think if, Rishi Sunak knew about the Wizarding World, he'd just be like, oh, okay, sure. No, there'd be shit would hit the fan, you know? But anyway, although I would imagine the Ministry of Magic would monitor the British government very extensively and use espionage, and I mean, they can fucking fly. I mean, I don't think espionage would be too difficult with magic, but I can imagine they would get a very close eye on it, and especially on MI5 and GCHQ, just to ensure that they don't have any suspicions or anything like that. I also think that as Muggle surveillance technology would get more impressive, that would be way more difficult. So if you're a wizard in like the 1700s, if you want to keep an eye on Parliament, that's one thing. If there's CCTV, you got to be very careful, because you start flying around on a broomstick or in a flying car, people can fucking see you. The UK is, I think, the third most surveilled country in the world, behind China and India. Like, there is no way that shit is not getting caught on CCTV. So anyway, that would be getting much more difficult. Also, whether an individual is born with magic powers, so wizarding abilities, would be completely up to chance. You can't induce it, and the natural chance of an individual having powers would be very, very low. So there's no ethnic basis, for example, to being wizard. It's not as if some ethnic groups are more likely to get it than others. It's not as if some ethnic phenotypes. So a phenotype, by the way, is just your outward appearance. So you can speak of a Caucasian phenotype or an East Asian phenotype. Those are massive generalizations, both of them, because those are massive groups of people, but it's still something which grammatically makes sense. So it's not ethnic-based or phenotype-based, it's genuinely just based on chance, and it's a very, very low chance. So I looked it up. The population of wizard in Great Britain, we're going to get down to that in a moment, by the way, is about 12,000 individuals. Now, the population in people, in general, human beings, in Great Britain currently is about 69 million, which means that 1 out of every 5,750 individuals in the United Kingdom are wizards, right? Currently, at the moment. So if we can generalize that, we could say that in a nation state, the ratio of wizards to muggles is the proportion of wizards in that state is 1 out of 5,750. It's 1 over 5,750. No, 1 over 5,750. Sorry. Even then, you can't really generalize that because loads of different nation states have different demographics. They have different trends of immigration. They have different trends of fertility. So different numbers of people give birth to different kids. Also, some places aren't nation states. You have nations without states, for example, the Uyghurs or the Kurds. All that's very complicated. We're going to get into it later. But let's just say that in a nation state, in a country, you have like a wizarding shadow country within that country, and 1/5,750th of all people in that country will be part of that wizarding shadow country. So if that's completely constant in the world and follows demographic trends, then in the world, there are 1.424 million wizards. So if you look at the world population, 1/5,750th of that is 1.424 million. So that's how many people we're dealing with here. So due to the consequent smallness of the wizarding population, so in Great Britain, there's 12,000 wizards. That's not much. So the secrecy of wizarding society for Muggle society, I would say, has been feasible throughout history, especially if you have the Deus Ex Machina of magic, which Rowling seems to do. So Harry Potter, one of my biggest bugbears at Harry Potter, and biggest bugbears. God, I'm becoming a boomer. This episode is making me a boomer. Actually, Harry Potter isn't realistic because of the macroeconomics. But you know what I mean. One of the things that I have with Harry Potter's world building is that there's no... J.K. Rowling's created a magic system. She's had the entire world building centered around that magic system, and that hasn't been explained at all. There's no conceptual limits as to what magic can do. We don't know what it can't do. We don't know how it works. We don't know what it uses up. We don't know why people don't just do magic every single second, because there's no drawback to doing it. I'm not trying to shit on J.K. Rowling when I'm doing this per se. So J.K. Rowling, if you are watching this, I'm not trying to bully you. Obviously, J.K. Rowling would not be watching this. That would be a very weird turn of events if she was watching this. J.K. Rowling, if you're watching this, I am surprised you don't have other things to be doing. You've got plenty of transphobic stuff to be putting on social media, mate. Go get on that. Oh, we really need you doing that. Anyway, so I think it'd be feasible that you'd be able to hide this wizarding population from the world. So wizards have been able to live isolated from muggles, and they've established their own societies, their own governments, their own institutions. So we see this. So in the world that J.K. Rowling creating, that's what happened. You have wizarding Great Britain. You have this kind of shadow nation state living within the nation state that is Great Britain. It's its own society. There's a government, there's its own institutions, so there's its own political institutions, its own law courts, its own economic institutions. An institution is just sort of like, It's a structure that forms the fabric of society. So the police is an institution. The law courts are an institution. Universities or education is an institution. The political systems that you have set up is an institution. The economic policies that you have set up are institutions. They're just parts of the fabric of society. But that also means that if there's a wizarding nation state in Great Britain, then there should be various wizarding nation states existing around the world as this kind of secret shadow enclave in their respective Muggle societies. So you have a wizarding Great Britain in the UK, but you'd also expect a wizarding France hidden in France, a wizarding Germany, a wizarding Brazil, a wizarding China. Well, that leads to the point when it comes to colonialism. So I believe canonically there is a wizarding USA. So is it the case that if one country, let's say Great Britain, when Great Britain was colonizing New Zealand, did wizards go along with New Zealand? Is there like a wizarding New Zealand that developed before the political existence of New Zealand? So before New Zealand became a sovereign entity, was there a sovereign wizarding New Zealand? Was there a wizarding New Zealand at all? Did any wizards emigrate? So it's all very hazy. But let's say that in the world right now, for every current state, there is a wizarding shadow state. But there's a difference between a nation state and a state. So a nation it's a group of people which identify a particular way. So the British people, the British nation is this aggregate of individuals who all see themselves as British. The French nation is this aggregate of people who all see themselves as French. And they have their own states. There is a British state, there is a French state. They're not ethno-states. So being British or French, being French isn't really defined anymore as being ethnically British or ethnically French. It's about the identity which you adopt. So that is a nation state. Germany is a nation state. But there are plenty of nations which don't have a state. So for example, the Kurds, the Kurdish people do not have a state, but there is a large aggregate of people who identify in this certain way. So there's no Kurdistan, so you have a nation without a state. It's also possible to have a state without a nation. You don't really see this anymore, but multi-ethnic empire, like for example, the Habsburg Empire in the 1800s, I think would have been a state without a nation. So it's still a state. You have the political framework of a state with the governing institutions, but there's no nation underpinning that. So consequently, as soon as nationalism became a powerful idea in the 1800s and the 1900s, that state collapsed. It didn't work. So anyway, I think in a realistic Harry Potter, all ethnic groups would have an equal percentage chance of an individual being magic. So wizards of all human ethnicities exist, and therefore consequent nation states would all exist. I believe that there would be a Kurdish Ministry of Magic. There would be a wizarding Kurdistan, a wizarding Uyghur, there would be a Uyghur Ministry of Magic. Obviously, a Muggle government couldn't oppress them. So, for example, if you had like a wizarding Kurdistan, the government of Turkey would not have the power suitable to prevent them from establishing their own nation state. Also, they probably wouldn't know about it. So if there are wizarding Kurds, if you have this ethnic group and some members of that Kurdish ethnic group are born as wizards, they would be able to set up their own society as a kind of shadow enclave. And presumably the territory of that society, that wizarding Kurdistan, would be set up in the place where actual Kurdistan would be were it a state. I'm using Kurdistan just as an example here because I think the Kurds are the largest nation that exists without the state, but there's loads of them. There's loads of there's like a Wikipedia article for movements for nations to become states. There's loads and loads and loads of them. There's lots in Russia actually, because Russia is such a massive territory. Like it's 11% of the world's landmass. So there's loads of ethnic groups in Russia. There's loads of nations which don't have their own state. But anyway. Now, what is debatable is whether there be like a wizarding Turkey that would therefore attack wizarding Kurdistan and oppress the wizarding Kurds and prevent the wizard Kurds from having their own state. I would argue no, for reasons that I will explore later. So in my conception of realistic Harry Potter, there are wizarding nation states. Nationalistic conflicts do not occur between wizards. More on that later. So the nature of wizarding societies would differ a lot from Muggle societies because there's a very different power balance between wizarding governments, so the elites in a wizarding society, and the masses. So for most of human history, human societies have been extremely hierarchical. So from when civilization begins at around 4000 to 35 or 3400 BC, depending on the historian, up until very, very recently, societies were based on hierarchy. There were individuals, there were privileged classes in these societies. For example, aristocracies that were inherently privileged. They were inherently better than the masses, and they just oppressed the shit out of the masses. And the first time that began to change was in the 1700s, in this movement in Western Europe called the Enlightenment, which I talk about massively in this series. We talk about the Enlightenment and liberalism a lot in Polymath. But essentially the point is that before the 1700s, the idea of all people being equal, the idea of all people having a right to happiness, the idea of happiness even mattering for most people, apart from the elites in a society, was just completely absurd. It did not exist in communal psychology. So, for example, when Southern Americans in the 1800s had slaves, in order to justify that slavery, they had to argue that these slaves were property. They were chattels. They weren't legally people. For all of human history, when slavery, up until the 1800s, when all societies practiced slavery, so from that vast stretch of human civilization from 4000 BC to 1700 AD, to the 1700s, 1800s AD, when all societies practiced slavery, before the Enlightenment, people did not need to justify slavery. They simply said, yes, you slaves are people. We acknowledge you are human beings. We just don't give a fuck. We do not care if you are happy. So, for the vast majority of human civilization, human society has been wildly hierarchical, consisting of a narrow elite of 0 to a few percent of the population, oppressing the piss out of everyone else. But in wizarding society, that's very difficult to do. Because if every single individual in wizarding society is both armed, they have wands, and they're capable of using those wands, the power balance is very different. So societies in our world were rigidly hierarchical because that was possible, because a narrow elite in these societies, for the vast majority of human civilization, had a soldier caste, so a class, a socioeconomic tier, a stratum in society responsible for carrying out violence. And they used this class of people who were trained both physically and psychologically for violence and armed for violence in order to oppress that population and maintain that power imbalance. So when a peasant in Western Europe or ancient China or the Inca Empire or Mesopotamia or East Africa or wherever has to bow to a nobleman and give him a large proportion of his property, and if the nobleman humiliates him or abuses him or just straight up kills him, there's nothing the peasant can do about it. That power imbalance is maintained by armed force. Because if the peasants rebel, then the elites in a society, both themselves being militarily trained and also having a military caste at their disposal, then just slaughter the peasants every time they rebel. So, for example, in the 1500s, there was this massive peasant rebellion in Germany called the German Peasants' War. The result was that tens of thousands of peasants were just slaughtered because the power and the military balance of power favored the elites. But in wizarding society, that's not the case, because everyone can fight. So it's extremely difficult to oppress a wizarding population because every single wizard is a trained and powerful soldier. So as a result, I believe that in wizarding societies, it would be impossible to enforce slavery or serfdom or peasantry or hierarchy, because it's possible to do that because if the masses of a country are each as individuals approximately, roughly as powerful as the elites of that country, obviously, there are trained wizards, like, for example, auras, who are particularly capable of violence. But the point is that in, let's say, 1300 AD in ancient China, if you were a peasant and you were up against a professional soldier who is armored, you would need a fuck ton of you, all to swarm that soldier at the same time to kill them. If you're wizards, it's really easy to do. If you're completely untrained and you're up against an aura, as long as you know basic magic, you can kill them. You don't need to use Avada Kedavra. You can literally just go like Accio knife. And as long as that knife was coming from behind said aura, it would kill it. Kill him or her. Let's not dehumanize the auras. But you know what I'm saying? So as a result, I believe that it would be impossible to maintain a hierarchical society in Wizarding World. So as a result, they all have to be immensely more equal and equitable. Because if there's a peasant rebellion, if there's a peasant revolt in the Wizarding World, if all of those peasants have the power to summon fire or water or use Sectum Sumpra and just fucking explode people's organs or summon things or fly or whatever, you can't really oppress them. What are you going to do, So Wizarding societies have therefore been immensely more equal, equitable, and democratic than Muggle societies for millennia, because that power imbalance has always existed. But as the nature of Wizarding society has shifted, the specific political structure has also shifted. So after the Industrial Revolution, which occurred in the Muggle world, There's no the wizarding world seems to have access to the products of the Industrial Revolution, but there does not seem. So if you watch the Harry Potter series and read the books and use the wiki, there is no evidence of a manufacturing or an industrial manufacturing activity. People still make stuff, they make it in their homes. Like, there's no wizarding mechanization, there's no wizarding assembly lines, there's no wizarding factory floors, there's no wizarding machines. Now, in my rewrite of Harry Potter, that's still the same. There is still no wizarding industrial revolution. But because the wizarding economy and therefore society is so entangled with the Muggle economy, and we're going to explore that later, the industrial revolution in the Muggle world still had very profound effects on wizarding society. So in wizarding society, we gradually emerged into social democratic welfare states with high government transparency and accountability. So what does that mean? So what is social democracy? I talk about social democracy in another episode of Polymath, in episode 11, I believe. But basically, for the sake of this, just think of the Nordic model. For example, think of the Nordic model. So you have states where there's a high degree of government intervention in the economy. They're very democratic states. The intervention in the economy is meant to be for the benefit of the masses of for the masses of that society, rather than just a narrow financial elite. And that's enforceable because if every wizard is capable of making their voice heard, if every wizard is very powerful, then it means that it's very difficult to create a shitty, disjointed society which doesn't actually benefit people, because it's very difficult to oppress wizards. So it's likely that they'd all have their political voice. So they've created a society which works, which benefits them. And I've chosen the Nordic model here because out of all known political and economic models which humanity has ever tried, the Nordic model seems to be the best for human happiness. So happiness ratings, human development index, inequality adjusted human development index, all these objective measures of how well a country is doing, they're always highest in the Nordic countries. Now, obviously, we can't subjectively measure that. We cannot gain some kind of revealed divine truth into how it is to live in each country. But what we can do is gather statistics. And the statistical picture is pretty clear in saying that whatever these Nordic countries are doing, their model of dealing with society, it's the best way of doing it. It is the approach that leads the most to human happiness based on what we know about human happiness and what we know about these societies. No other political approach has yielded those results. So we can theorize about, for example, communist utopias or socialist utopias. And in fact, I've done episodes on all these things. So I've done an episode on communism, I've done an episode on socialism. But what we know for a fact, based on what works, based on surveying the evidence, is that this is the thing that works. So to me, it makes sense that a wizarding society where the individuals of that society, the mass of society, had an actual voice in shaping that society, and they could therefore mold the desirable one, it would be molded into that society. Now, I could say that perhaps a socialist society would be even better. So in this world where all wizards are able to make their voice heard, they create a socialist society. But because I don't know for sure how great a socialist society would actually be, what I do know is that attempts to establish socialism in the 20th century created very much the opposite of what was intended. But I'm not going to base the decision off that because the circumstances are very different. But the point that I'm trying to make is that we know that this works. So that's probably what, so I'm just going to say that that's what they've tried to establish. So, and also I don't know how, because socialism came about as a concept due to the impressiveness of industrial capitalism. So, for example, in the early 1800s, you'd have workers working 16 hours a day, getting limbs torn off in machines and just dying on the streets, starving to death because they couldn't work. You have people crammed into these tiny, disgustingly tiny homes, 5 people crammed into a bed, everyone dying of cholera, all while a narrow clade of people who exploited that became ungodly, obscenely rich. That is the background, the environment within which socialism developed. If you have a wizarding society, which is much more equitable and which has much less exploitation, because it's impossible to exploit wizards, because the ultimate balance of power in these societies favors the masses, it's debatable whether socialism or communism would have ever even surfaced in the wizarding world, because these ideologies came out as a response to oppression. They obviously also came out as a response to the Industrial Revolution, but the point is that utopian ideologies like socialism, even if, so communism, for example, did exist in some forms before the Industrial Revolution. There is a pre-1800s history of communism. The point is that these ideologies arose in response to oppression, which wouldn't necessarily be the case in the wizarding world. So, what I believe would happen is that in wizarding Great Britain, you have the British Ministry of Magic, which is genuinely representative of the people, genuinely transparent, genuinely democratic, and supports a very elaborate system of welfare and state support programs. And we're going to be talking more about the political structure of wizarding Great Britain and wizarding society a little bit later, and the kind of social structure of it later. I'm just giving you an overview. Now, another thing that I've had to write in, just like a little extra, is the effect of magic on electricity. Just because there has to be, I looked it up, and there is some kind of interference effect in the official Harry Potter world canon of between magic and electricity. There's some kind of effect. It's not really clearly quantified or described because nothing in the world building is really clearly quantified or described. So the way that I've done it is magic has a mild interference effect on electricity. So electrical items can still work in the presence of wizards, in the presence of magic, in the presence of magical objects and phenomena. But in a place like Hogwarts, where you have this massive abundance, this concentration of magic in one place, that would prevent an electrical item from working. So that's just sort of like a very rough overview of the wizarding world as a whole. Right. So, let's talk about wizarding society. So we've kind of mentioned that wizarding Great Britain consists of about 12k individuals. The proportion of wizards in a nation state, specifically in the British nation state, is 1/5750th. If you keep that ratio constant throughout the world, which it probably wouldn't be, but if you keep it constant throughout the world, then in the world, there are 1.424 million wizards. Now, the key question is, are there racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, nationalism in the wizarding world? Do these demons of human psychology exist in the wizarding world? Now, for the sake of an interesting world building, I've said no. I've gone for, what if these don't exist anymore? What if they're kind of past this? And you do see this in the wizarding world. There doesn't seem to be any actual racism against humans or sexism against humans or homophobia, nationalism. There's transphobia from J.K. Rowling, but it's not present in the Harry Potter world. And even then, frankly, I don't really give a shit. J.K. Rowling made the world. Thanks, mate. I'll take it from here. Cheers. But human nature is still constant. What makes psychology applicable to the Harry Potter world, what I want, because as I said, what I like here, what I'm interested in, is this integration of the fantasy and the real. What if we take a fantasy world with the richness and the magic and the circumstances of that world, and we apply real human psychology, real economic laws, real political science to this world? What do we get? So if human psychology is what it is, the thing is though, discrimination, prejudice, bigotry, hierarchy, and extremism, these still exist. Because these come from demons in human nature. These phenomena, for example, discrimination, that exists in human beings' heads, right? That is not a tangible thing in the world. That is generated by human psychology. What generates that? Now, we talk about this a lot in previous episodes. And in episode 16, which is how democracies elect dictators, the root source of all this kind of stuff, this discrimination, prejudice, bigotry, hierarchy, extremism, it's talked about a lot more. The psychological causes of these plagues in human society. But as just a very simple run through, human beings tend to engage in dichotomous thinking. We tend to engage in us versus them thinking. And you see this all the time. You see it in politics, you see it in religions, you see it in nations, you see it in football teams, you see it in all kinds of stuff. This capacity to categorize people as members of an in-group, i.e. a group of people sharing some characteristic that you do, whether that be your political affiliation or your football team, and out-group, a group of people who don't. And people tend to cleave towards loyalty towards their in-group and hostility towards the out-group. And if that hostility is exploited enough, it leads to dehumanization of that out-group and eventually enables acts of violence against that out-group, which you see, for example, in wars. Especially in wars, civil wars drawn on political lines like the Finnish Civil War, where you have massive politicide from either side, mostly from the right wing, the Finnish Civil War. In fact, the politicide carried out by the right wing in the Finnish Civil War was about 10 times more bloody than the politicide carried out by the left wing. But the point is that it occurred in both sides. It was a constant in human nature during that war. So you have this in-group, out-group dichotomy. The actual nature of an individual's out-group is fluid though. So you have individuals who aren't racist or sexist or homophobic or nationalistic. But the point is that everyone has some kind of out-group. So for example, your out-group could just be the far left or the far right or rapists or murderers, etc., etc., etc. Theoretically, if you were the Buddha, you wouldn't have an outgroup at all, but neither of us are the Buddha. The point is that the outgroup itself is flexible. So it's possible to not be racist or sexist or homophobic or transphobic or nationalist. And that does seem to be the case in the wizarding world as we see it in the Harry Potter books. There's no mention of any of these things. There's no indication of either of these things. So what I've gone for in the rewrite is to say, here's the thing. If human nature is still constant, but the nature of our outgroup thinking, the sources of our ire as in IRE, the sources of human hostility are different. What would that be? Well, you actually see it. So, for example, status towards Muggleborns and the status of Muggleborns in society, views towards Muggleborns, discrimination towards Muggleborns, the issue of squibs, so magical individuals, so wizarding individuals, or individuals in the wizarding world who are not capable of performing magic. So Filch in Hogwarts is a squib, for example. The civil rights of house elves, so the status of house elves, this sentient race who is essentially enslaved, the relationship of humans with goblins, because goblins tend to be this sort of second-class citizen stratum in the wizarding world who tend to be universally looked down on, the use of dementors, etc., etc., etc. So you still have groups which can form part of that out-group discrimination. And because of that, you still have the capacity for political differences over these groups. So, for example, in the books, in Prisoner of Azkaban, I think, Hermione starts a society for the protection of house elves. And that kind of nascent campaign for house elf civil rights, that could easily mirror the real campaign for civil rights in our world. I am not at all saying that minorities in our world are the same as house elves. Not at all. What I am saying is that if you look at the civil rights in the Western world, there was a large group of people who at the time could be labelled conservatives. Conservative just because the nature of conservatism as a political stance is that of opposing change. So if you have a society within where African Americans are second-class citizens, conservatives, by definition, oppose the granting of civil rights to that dynamic. You have progressives who fight for civil rights. Similarly, in the Harry Potter world, we have an issue, the civil rights of house elves. We have conservatives who oppose the granting of civil rights to house elves. We have progressives, like Hermione Granger, who support the granting of civil rights to house elves. So in any kind of, as long as there is some kind of socio-cultural issue, you have this dynamic between progressives who want to change the issue and conservatives who don't want to change the issue. You have a group of people fighting for change and a group of people opposing change. That, by the way, is the essence of what it means to be a progressive or conservative throughout history. So, for example, a conservative in 1806 would have opposed the abolition of the slave trade. A progressive in 1806 would have supported the abolition of the slave trade. A conservative in 1917 would have opposed the granting of voting rights to all people in the UK, all males in the UK rather, regardless of property, of economic wealth. A progressive would have supported it. The idea of being progressive or conservative, and I talk about this a lot more in episode 8, which is about what the left wing and right wing actually mean, but these concepts are fluid. They depend on the issue. The issue of these concepts are fluid, but the basic stance of them, one camp opposing change, the other camp pushing for change, is constant. And that would apply to the wizarding world as well. So similarly, the use of dementors, the status of muggleborns, the issue of muggleborns, I think, nicely mirrors the issue of racism and feminism in the Western world, where you do have legislation. There's no legal ability for countries to discriminate against women or African Americans. But if you look at society, African Americans, I mean, the rates of police killings, rates of incarceration, but also economic status. So if you look at the economic quartiles in the USA, the average African American is much poorer than the average European American, and many in the bottom economic quartiles of the USA, I'm just using the USA as an example, by the way, it tends to be disproportionately inhabited by African Americans. Similarly with feminism, with the issue of women in society, it is not legally permissible to discriminate against women, but it still very much happens. And obviously there's testaments, that is, stuff like the wage gap, for example. There's controversy on whether the wage gap does exist. I don't really know what to say. It just does. That is a fact. You may accept it or you may choose not to. I don't know. If that angers you, you're welcome to go and read a book. And of course, there's lots of cultural discrimination against women. I mean, it's a very common trope of women not being taken seriously. And if you are a woman, you will likely have many stories about not being taken seriously, or at least relative to a man. Sorry, you won't be taken seriously compared to how men would be taken seriously. You'd be treated differently to how men would be treated seriously, etc., etc., etc. I believe that in the wizarding world, the issue of muggleborns would be the exact same. There would be no legal discrimination of muggleborns. It would be illegal to say deny someone a job because they were muggleborn, but it would still happen. So, for example, there was a really big study that showed that individuals who applied to jobs with African-based names, African-American names rather than European-American names, were about 40% as likely to have said job accepted. So even though legally there is no discrimination discrimination. Even though legally there is no discrimination against these groups, socioculturally, in the psychology of large sections of the populace, that discrimination still exists. And we see that in people like Malfoy. So the Malfoys discriminate. They are prejudiced against Muggleborns. Even though there is no legal discrimination or prejudice against Muggleborns, enshrined in the legislature of the Wizard in Great Britain, it still exists as an idea in the population. So, etc. Now, the vitriol of these attitudes, the vitriol and the appeal of attitudes against Muggleborns or anti-House Elf attitudes or anti-Goblin attitudes, or just more extreme right-wing viewpoints in general, or indeed more extreme left-wing views in general, varies just like in Muggle societies throughout time and based on the current socioeconomic conditions of the wizarding world. So in the Western world, for example, there have been periods of greater and lesser political polarization. We're living in a period of very significant political polarization, for example. So we're seeing that the socioeconomic and political dynamics of the Western world are currently conducive towards a large degree of political polarization. And we're seeing that right-wing parties in the Western world have been moving further right as a result. A classic example of this is the Republican Party, which has been moving significantly more right since the onset of the 21st century. The point is that, that's based on prevailing socioeconomic conditions. We also see right now a massive kind of culture war in the West between left and right due to, first of all, as a backlash between, so the Western world has been getting much more progressive in the past few decades. The discourse with LGBT rights or feminism or racism has completely changed in the past few decades. On environmental discourse, it's completely changed. Society has become more progressive throughout time, and we can see this objectively. So there's this survey called the World Values Survey, which basically goes to a bunch of different countries and basically asks them about their views on social cultural issues like feminism, abortion, divorce, euthanasia, religion, family values, father, paternal, patriarchal authority over the family, the role of women in society, etc., 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 etc. And they find the world has been getting much more progressive in the past few decades. They also find that, for example, there's this thing, I don't know if it's actually the name, but there's an index which measures how feminist an individual's attitudes are. And it basically shows that women in the 1960s were less feminist than men in the 1990s. So society has been becoming much more progressive. But if society does become more progressive, and by the way, one of the strongest correlations in different countries between progressive attitudes is wealth. So the World Value Survey has been around since 1981, and it shows that wealthier regions in the world tend to be more progressive, and as regions get wealthier, they tend to get more progressive as well. And the Western world has been getting steadily wealthier since the Industrial Revolution. And in fact, we do see a shift in social cultural values to more and more progressive levels. So for example, the status of African Americans now is completely different than it was 100 years ago before civil rights, and even then it was completely different before 200 years ago, before the abolition of slavery. So the Western world has been getting more progressive, and that is bound to generate a backlash from individuals who view these changes as too fast. So conservatism, essentially as a political stance, is resistance to change. If you were to go into conservative psychology, you could say that the change in a society based on whatever metric of change it is, so whether it's the changing position of women in society, whether it's the changing perception of homosexuals in society, etc., etc. And obviously there are many different flavors of conservatism, and flavors of conservatism which oppose feministic gains and LGBT plus gains are only two very different subtypes. But the point is that what's happening in the psychology of a conservative when they oppose change, essentially they notice a change, they view that change as bad, they view it as a threat in some way, they are threatened by that change, and they seek to remedy that change, or rather prevent that change. That's the essential dynamic that's going on. So it makes sense that as society progresses in a leftward direction, there would be a backlash against it. At the same time, when you have periods of economic distress, when people's standards of living start to go down or stagnate, you see that socio-cultural discord, that kind of cultural conflict, massively intensified. And that's what we're seeing now. So since the 70s, real wages have stagnated for the majority of the population, whilst for the 1%, for example, in Western societies, they've increased massively. Economic inequality has increased massively. For many people, unemployment, cost of living, standard of living, these have all changed negatively. And that combination of economic distress and also socio-cultural change and therefore conflict are the driving forces between the current political polarization and extremism and general level of threat in the Western world that we're experiencing today. By the way, that's happened before. So in the 1970s, for example, you had a very similar situation. In the 1930s, you had a very similar situation. In the 1870s, you had a very similar situation. Almost periodically, almost cyclically, you have these two combinatory factors of social cultural change coupled with economic distress, and that leads to a surge in more extremist thinking, but it tends to be more right-wing thinking. So in the Western world, in all of these decades, all these periods that I've mentioned, the Western world has taken a great shift rightwards. And by the way, we talk more about the meanings of left-wing and right-wing in many other episodes during this podcast, but typically episode 8. But you get the point. So in the Western world, that tends to be the result of this distress. However, in Wizarding Society, I've written that universally, between the left wing and the right wing, back to Wizarding Society. So we went on a big tangent there. Well, it's not a tangent because it's very relevant, but it's not very Harry Potter based, is it? The 1930s aren't very Harry Potter based. Although, was there a Wizarding fascism? Was there a Wizarding Nazi party? Was there a Wizarding Mussolini? I don't know. I mean, Grindelwald is kind of styled as a bit of a wizard fascist, but it's not really the same. Was there, in the 1930s, in Wizarding Germany, were there Wizarding Nazis? So the argument that I put forward in this rewrite is no, because anti-Semitism and political dislike for Bolsheviks they characterize psychological attitudes of normal Germany, but not Wizarding Germany. Because if the outgroup of Wizarding Society is not Jews or homosexuals or communists, then Nazi rhetoric doesn't make any sense. So I do not think there would have been a Wizarding Nazi party, because the particular outgroups that the Nazi party demonized, the way that the Nazi party generated a sense of threat in individuals that caused them to be voted for, that would not have been applicable to Wizarding Germany. But the point that I'm making is that the individuals in Wizarding Germany still have human nature, and therefore there is still the capacity that they would support, that they would demonize outgroups, that they would dehumanize individuals, that they would potentially vote for dictators. And that capacity, that potentiality, is something which I explore in that rewrite of Harry Potter. But we'll talk about that later. And also, if you want to hear about how the Nazis got the vote in Germany in 1933, and in general about how democracies elect dictators, just check out episode 16 of Polymath. So, in the Wizarding world, Muggle studies is a very looked down on subject. It's kind of universally seen as a bit of a contemptible thing to do. So, in the value system of Wizarding society, just as how in the value system of Western society, certain professions, for example, being a newspaper vendor, are seen as less prestigious than other professions, for example, being a doctor, the same dynamic applies in Wizarding society, even if the professions are different. So in Wizarding society, Muggle studies is seen as a very unprestigious, lowly subject, and that's universal across the political spectrum. So knowledge about any kind of Muggle arts, Muggle sciences, Muggle social sciences, they're not being taught in Wizarding schools. They're not being taught to any wizards. They're completely absent in Wizarding scholarship or Wizarding academic discourse. So as a result, nobody in the Wizarding world knows anything about engineering, manufacturing, technology. No one knows shit. So one of the reasons why there was no Wizarding Industrial Revolution is because no one knows shit about machines. Because it's not magical. It's a Muggle thing. It's a mundane thing. So no one's learned about anything about it. So anything non-magical, so textiles, clocks, typewriters, etc., is therefore not manufactured in Wizarding society because no one knows how to do it. No one knows how to make a fucking clock. You might have people making textiles in simple methods in their own homes. So, for example, Molly Weasley makes clothes for the Weasley family. That's fine. But Molly Weasley would not be able to mass produce textiles because she doesn't know how the machines work. She doesn't know how any kind of industrial processes work. She has no knowledge of that, nor does anyone in society. So magical items like potions are manufactured, but they're not manufactured with machine processes. They're manufactured by individuals. More on that later. So essential non-magical items like clothes, for example, because Molly Weasley kind of makes clothes for the family, but you can see that that's not really where they're getting these clothes from, right? Like if you go on Diagon Alley and if you Molly Weasley is not sufficient to supply the entire Wizarding world with clothing. You know what I mean? Like there have to be people who are distributing these goods to the Wizarding world. Now, in my conception of Harry Potter, in the realistic conception of Harry Potter, if you look at Diagon Alley and you go to clothes shops, they're not making that themselves. There's no machinery. No one knows how to make or operate machines. The way that non-magical items are acquired, so clothes or shoes or clocks, They can be made by simple handmade processes that predate the Industrial Revolution, but also a lot of them are stolen from Muggle society. They're just nicked. So mass death from Muggle society is easy because you can use magic, and you can use magical equipment. So for example, if you have an invisibility cloak or the Imperious Curse, it's very easy to take shit. But also there are certain things that you can make as well. It's just that, for example, making shoes is one thing. Making a typewriter, which in the Harry Potter movie series is the most advanced piece of technology that you see in the wizarding world, no wizard knows how to do that. A typewriter is not something that you can just, like, whip up. You don't just cook up a typewriter. You need to know things about engineering to make that. So no one is manufacturing typewriters. People are only manufacturing simple goods that predate the Industrial Revolution. So due to the small numbers of wizards, you can do this. So Muggle manufacturers can be feasibly requisitioned in secret and introduced into the wizarding economy. And once they're in the wizarding economy, the way they're distributed is either by the government, so the government gives stuff out. For example, in the wizarding world that I've created, wands would be given out by the government, because to make wands subject to market forces, if a wand is such an essential good, then it just wouldn't be subject to market forces. So for example, healthcare in the UK is an essential good, so it's not subject to market forces. It is in the USA, but the USA is a much more economically right-wing society. It's a much less economically regulated society. The point is that often in society, when we have essential goods, we don't leave it up to the market to distribute those goods. The government, acting on behalf of the people, plays a hand in doing that. So in wizarding society, it's kind of the same thing with some goods. With other goods, it is up to the market. So for example, clocks. There is no government distribution of clocks. That's based on market forces. People are either making clocks if they can, or taking clocks from the Muggle economy and introducing them to the wizarding world, and then simple market forces of supply and demand determines who gets these clocks. And there's a contempt for Muggle technology in general. There's a complete disregard for Muggle technology. And we can see that because a typewriter is the most advanced piece of technology in the wizarding world, there's around a 200-year delay between Muggle technology being created and then being introduced in wizarding society. And that makes sense. If you have a wizarding society which is completely ignorant of Muggle technology and can only just requisition it, so something like a flying car is not it makes sense that the Weasley family would have a flying car, because Arthur Weasley knows about Muggle studies. But flying cars would not at all be common in the Wizarding Great Britain, because no one knows shit about cars. There's a large delay between technology being created and technology then becoming introduced into the Wizarding world because of this contempt towards that technology. People don't want to adopt Muggle technology. It's not seen as something that people want to do. And if that sounds irrational, there's historically that kind of thing happens all the time. And if you look at something like crop rotation, for example, which is such an essential agricultural advance, it was delayed for a massive amount of time because you had to really convince people to want to do it. Like, people, if you tell some random European peasant that the beans in this field have to take turns, he'd be like, fuck off. But actually, that was a really important societal advance. So even typewriters are only used in Gringotts, which is the most sophisticated institution in the entire wizarding world. So even then, I say there's a 200-year delay. Typewriters are not common use at all. No one's really using them. In the Ministry of Magic in Hogwarts, nobody is using typewriters. So in reality, it takes 200 years for Muggle technology to enter the wizarding world at all. But it probably takes way longer for Muggle technology to become mainstream in the wizarding world. So there's a centuries delay. So this complete lack of non-magical education in the wizarding world and the complete lack of openness to Muggle technology means that innovation in the wizarding Great Britain, or in the wizarding world in general, just doesn't exist. Wizarding society is stagnant. It's entirely dependent on the Muggle economy for the provision of goods. So crops can be grown by magic, but really it runs on requisitions from the Muggle economy. There's stuff that you can make, but people aren't really making them. Like, there's a few stores in Diagon Alley, but people aren't growing crops in their backyards. They're not making clothes in their backyards. They're not cobbling together their own shoes. There's no mention in the wizarding world ever of professional cobblers or craftsmen or anything like that. So it seems that while wizards occasionally do engage in craftsmanship and may occasionally sell these wares, the majority of goods in wizarding society are coming from the Muggle world. So you can see that my rewrite of the wizarding world here is based in this aspect on what J.K. Rowling's conception of the wizarding world is. You can see an alignment there, because I'm saying that in J.K. Rowling's world, no one's making shit. I'm saying that in my rewrite of Harry Potter, no one's making shit. So magical supplies are produced. So magical supplies, for example, a love potion or a broomstick or a wand, they are produced, but they're not made by machines. They're made by workers using magic, because the wizarding world has no technology for automation. So Felix Fish's potions, for example, are being produced. They'll be being produced in state-owned factories, though, and they'll just be distributed to auras, government employees, doctors. There'd be a potion makers union, because as I mentioned, it's impossible to oppress wizards, so they'd all have very strong institutions advancing their own interests. But the point is that Felix Fish's potions would not just be distributed willy-nilly. That would be a very tightly regulated, a very heavily regulated thing. A luck potion is a dangerous variable to be putting into society. Also, a love potion. A love potion would be like a Schedule 1 drug. That is basically a date rape drug. If you give someone love potions that they want to have sex with you, that's not really consent, is it? So that's a date rape drug. So no one would be making love potions. Love potions would be made by clandestine labs, by shady individuals. It would not be talked about in schools at all. So wands and brooms, because they are necessities for wizarding life, would be distributed by the state to wizards for free. Although there would also be markets for better models of wands and brooms. So for example, healthcare. Most Western societies have some kind of government provision for healthcare, but there's also a private provision for healthcare which is better. So if you want to do that, you can. So the wand disparity between classes would probably be practically nil, just because a wand is so essential. I can imagine that the masses would be very, very strongly motivated to do something about it. I imagine there'd be a slightly higher disparity between broom quality, depending on working and middle class wizards. Just because even though it would be the interest in the masses of wizard society to have very strong broom provision, it's very difficult to get a mass movement off the ground. It's difficult to do that because for each individual, it is your incentive as an individual to just let everyone else protest in the streets and therefore reap the benefits. And if it's in everyone's interest to do that, then nothing gets done. So protest movements are still difficult. So I can imagine a protest movement taking place in the wizarding world that shaped essentials to suit the conditions of the masses. So for example, they would establish a democracy. They would fight in the streets to establish democracy. They would fight in the streets to establish wand equality. But for something less fundamental like brooms, I'm not so certain. Also, Hogwarts. It is a private institution, as stated, as we see in the original J.K. Rowling world. But unlike in the J.K. Rowling conception of the wizarding world, Hogwarts would be really, really heavily regulated and overseen by the state, because it's the only educational institution in Wizarding Great Britain. There are other educational institutions across the world, but in WGB, Wizarding Great Britain, that's the only one. So it would naturally be a very, very important institution. Also, time turners, they'd all be destroyed by the government. Or maybe one would be kept in some top secret government vault somewhere, because that's just such a powerful, game-breaking level of technology. In the conception of the world that I've created, I've just said that all time turners would be destroyed, because first of all, if you have a very transparent government, it would be impossible. If it's really that transparent, they wouldn't be able to clandestinely keep a time turner. And also, for the sake of the story which I want to write, which is set in this world, time turners are just game breaking. So in The Prisoner of Azkaban, for example, I think a massive narrative mistake made by J.K. Rowling was to create the concept of a time turner, because then nothing matters. Nothing means anything. Once you can control time, you don't have a coherent story. Finally, Polyjuice Potion. That would be illegal for anyone to make or manufacture. And also, if the Ministry of Magic in this world would be very heavily scrutinized by the public. They'd be very transparent as institutions. So they wouldn't be able to hide a secret stash of Polyjuice potions. So, speaking of the Ministry of Magic, actually, let's talk a bit more about the Ministry of Magic, about this government institution in Wizarding Great Britain. What would it actually be like? How would it function? So in the Wizarding Great Britain that I've kind of conceptualized, this realistic conceptualization of Wizarding Great Britain, the Ministry of Magic has a unicameral legislature. So it's a parliament, a single house of parliament. There's no double houses. So there's no House of Lords, House of Commons. There's no Senate and Congress. It's just one house. So it's a parliament, and it consists of elected representatives of lots of different political parties. So there's no two-party system. All the representatives are elected. They are immediately recallable. So it's not the case that you elect a representative and they can do whatever the hell they want for their term. They can immediately be recalled by the public. So actually, in the 1800s, this is what socialists and anarchists and communists and other left-wing Western left-wing Westerners wanted. They wanted elected representatives which were immediately recallable. To my knowledge, no Western society has that yet. So the electoral policy of Wizarding Great Britain in this case, and remember, we're envisioning a society where, because it's impossible to oppress anyone, society is able to be molded according to the preference of the masses, because each member of those masses has a wand. They're magic. So it's pretty much impossible to oppress them. So by weight of numbers, they're able to shape the broad outline of how wizarding society and politics works. So the electoral policy is single transferable vote. So the voting policy in Great Britain and that we gave to the USA is first past the post. Now this leads to a two-party system. It's a winner-takes-all system. So in these kind of political systems, you don't vote for a third party because there's no point. Your vote just wouldn't mean anything. So that's not very democratic because you're stuck between, realistically, choosing the lesser evil of two parties. Now in single transferable vote, what happens is, let's say you have two choices. Let's say, just use a British example, choice number one is the Green Party, choice number two is the Labour Party. So your vote for the Green Party is counted, but if the Green Party don't win, instead of that, in your constituency rather, instead of that vote being wasted, your second choice is taken into account. So what you've done is you've said, I want the Green Party to be in power, but if not enough people in my constituency vote for Green, then my next best choice is Labour. And then your ballot gets counted as a choice towards Labour. So that way, you can vote for the party you actually want, whilst not endangering, running the risk of a party that you don't want to be getting into power. So single transferable vote. I believe in 2008, the Liberal Party, in their coalition with the Conservative government, actually ran a referendum on whether Britain would abandon the first past the post system, but there just wasn't really enough attention around it and no one really gave a shit. Because if you voiced it, because if you worded it as like, oh, we're running a referendum to end the two-party system, that would activate people. People would be like, ooh, that would be like, you'd see like neuron activation there. But first past the post, that's very vague. People don't know what that means. But anyway, so there would be first past the post. There'd be a system of limited proportional representation. So a party would need at least 5% of the vote to place representatives in the legislature. But as long as you exceeded that 5% boundary, then the representation in the legislature, so representation in that unicameral house, would be proportionate to the number of votes that you garnered. Now, you have a separation. You have the wizarding separation of powers in Wizarding Great Britain between executive, legislative, and judiciary. Although in practice in the British political system, the executive and legislature are linked, because the executive in the British political system, so the Prime Minister, is in charge of the legislature. They are the executive because they have majority control over the legislature. That way things can get done. So in the American Constitution, you have this strong separation between executive, the president, i.e. the individual who's voted and calls the shots, the legislature, i.e. the political body that makes laws, and the judiciary, so the Supreme Court, for example. And in the American Constitution, you have this clear separation of powers because the idea was to promote democracy. It was to prevent any kind of tyranny, any kind of dictatorship, any individual from consolidating too much power. The result of that, though, unfortunately, tends to be gridlock a lot of the time. Whereas the British political system is a little bit different because the executive and the legislature are a bit merged. So in Wizarding Great Britain, the executive, the Prime Minister for Magic, has the same relationship with the legislature and its parties as in the Muggle British political system. Now, in my rewrite of Harry Potter, initially, the government is all very stable. There's a very sound political situation. And the ruling party is just this centrist party, which I've called the Wizarding Democratic Republican Party, or the YWP. Why have I called it the Democratic Republican Party? Basically, just alluding to a merger between the American Democrat Party and the American Republican Party. Not that the WPD is related to those institutions in any way. I just wanted to convey the idea that this is a centrist party. It's a centrist party that doesn't have strong views on anything. Fun fact, though, the Democrat Party in the United States is actually called, technically, the Democratic Republican Party. So it was founded as, it's called technically the Democratic Republican Party, but you just call them the Democrats. They're also, the Democrats, they're the oldest political party in the United States. So the United States was just getting started in the late 1700s. You still had a two-party system, but the two parties within that system are different to the two parties within that system now. So right now, this two-party system, this dichotomy between Democrats and Republicans, is called the third party system. The second party system was in about the 1830s, 1840s. this dichotomy between the Democrat Party and the Whig Party. That's the second party system. And the first party system was this dichotomy between the Democrat Party and the Federalist Party in the late 1700s. But that's really all a topic for another time. The point is that we have the WDP, it's a centrist party. So currently, the way I've designed this series is that initially there's no real political polarization, but it's bubbling in the background. And as the series goes on, that political polarization gets more and more acute, and we see more of a societal move towards extremism. But currently, at the start of the series, it's just the ruling party is just a centrist party, and it's headed by Cornelius Fudge. It's just a status quo party, which currently has a majority in the ministry. So they're not in a coalition. There's a status quo party. They're just kind of like, they're not backing any changes. There are left-wing and right-wing parties initially in the Wizarding world at the start. In Wizarding Great Britain at the start of the series, but they're pretty moderate. They generally agree on major issues. There's not much political polarization in society, and the parties are all pretty friendly with each other. So the main left-wing party in Wizarding Great Britain is called the British section of the Wizards International, or the BSWI, colloquially known as the Section. The name itself is a parody of the socialist French section of the Workers' International Party. So the Section in my rewrite of Harry Potter are not socialist. I've just taken the name from there because it's interesting. And they take progressive views on Muggleborns, progressive views on the treatment of house elves. They support reconciliation with Goblin. They support the abolition of Dementors and punishment. But they're generally pro-establishment, non-radical politicians. They don't really back real change. They just want a slight progressive shift. Kind of like the Democrat Party in the USA. So the most progressive elements of a Wizarding society, the really dynamic elements of Wizarding society that really want change, they're not represented by this section. And the section gets on with other politicians because they don't really have any real differences. They disagree on, maybe some affirmative action for Muggleborns, maybe some change in the way house elves are treated, maybe getting rid of Dementors. But at the start of the series, this is kind of all they disagree on, and they don't disagree on it too vehemently. So that's a kind of overview of how politics would be in the Wizarding world if I were rewriting the series. So let's talk a little bit about Wizarding economics. Now, Wizarding economics I talk about way more in episode 3 of Polymath, which is about the macroeconomics of Harry Potter, but we can talk about it anyway. So in this universe, any kind of duplication of raw materials or any kind of transfiguration, so turning one thing into another thing, I've just made that non-possible. I've just said transfiguration, you can't do it. Even though in J.K. Rowling's conception of Harry Potter that was possible, because otherwise it opens up too many plot holes. It just completely breaks any world building that you can do. But the currency system, just as in the J.K. Rowling conception of Harry Potter, it's still based on precious metals. So gold and silver, for example. The metallic coins circulating in Wizarding Great Britain and the Wizarding economy are worth their weight in metal. Metal itself is not a sufficient currency. So people in Wizarding Great Britain pay with gold galleons. They don't pay with just solid gold. So it still needs to be minted. There still is a mint that is turning this raw metal into economic currency. It's just that economic currency is worth its weight in that metal, which I believe is the same situation as in J.K. Rowling's conception of the Wizarding economy. She doesn't really have a conception of the Wizarding economy. I just sort of scraped this information together from Pottermore or like Potter Wiki or whatever. So there's only one mint in Wizarding Great Britain, and that's owned and operated by Gringotts Bank, which, like in the J.K. Rowling conception of Harry Potter, is a private institution. It's also the only important financial institution in Wizarding Great Britain at all. I actually think when I was researching on the Potter Wiki about other nations' equivalents to Gringotts, I couldn't find anything. So it may even be the only real financial institution in the entire Wizarding world, but I think that's unlikely. I think it's just Gringotts for Wizarding Great Britain, and then there'll be other institutions for other Wizarding societies. So Wizarding France will have like Gringotts or whatever. I don't know. So Gringotts in this world is very heavily monitored by Ministry of Magic. Realistically, if that's the only important financial institution, that will be watched very, very carefully. But the government doesn't really intervene with what Gringotts does. And again, just like in the J.K. Rowling, in the original conception of Harry Potter, the only financial activities that Gringotts engages in are storing currency and minting coins. That's it. There's no loans. They don't give any loans. So when the Weasleys wanted to start their own joke shop, they had to get a loan from Harry Potter. They couldn't go to the bank to do it. There's no such thing as stocks. There's no bonds. There's no financial assets in general. There's no credit cards. There's no intangible bank accounts. The Wizarding economy, in both the realistic rewrite of Harry Potter and also J.K. Rowling's world in general. I'm going to stop referring to J.K. Rowling's world in general because it's just getting a little bit clumsy. But if you want to hear about how the wizarding economy works in the original conception of Harry Potter, as written by J.K. Rowling, just watch episode 3. So, the wizarding economy is entirely cash-based, and wizards will carry that cash with them with wallets or pouches that are larger on the inside than on the outside. So just how in the Goblet of Fire, the Weasleys had a tenet which was larger than the inside than on the outside, that ability to violate the laws of geometry, that applies to wallets as well. So precious metals are excavated from the earth with the use of these magical creatures, which do actually exist, called nifflers. I didn't make that up. The Potter Wiki does say that. And also by magical spells. I'm not really sure what a niffler is. That sounds like a word, like a verb. I've never niffled personally. If you have niffled, let me know. I'd love to know what that is. But they're excavated by nifflers, these magical creatures which go around in mines digging up metals, and by magical spells. There's also a wizarding miners union which is involved in this. So there's a union which controls the use of these magical creatures, and where you have these wizards who are doing the spells to actually get the metal out of the ground, bring it up to the surface, and have it transported. So the quantity of precious metals available to the wizarding world to wizarding Great Britain is low, because the stocks of precious metals in the ground in the UK are itself quite low. So the money supply, the actual total amount of precious metals circulating in wizarding Great Britain's economy, is only expanded by mining activity. Now nowadays, that mining activity occurs at a very limited pace, because it's getting really difficult to find precious metals now, basically. There's been lots of muggle mining activity in the UK. There's been lots of wizarding mining activity in the UK that have been going on for millennia. Now there's just not that much left. So it's quite hard finding new shit. So, because the financial system of wizarding Great Britain, and indeed the wizarding world in general, is so underdeveloped and weak, the wizarding currency is very, very unstable. So gold galleons, for example, are very unstable. But what does keep it more stable is the fact that inflation is quite limited, because the money supply itself isn't really growing. It's growing at a very slow rate. So if the actual induction of new currency into wizarding Great Britain is quite limited, and there's no other ways of gaining wealth, then inflation is ameliorated by that mechanism. But there's no government or private entity monitoring or caring about inflation at all, because no one knows shit about economics. No one knows what inflation even is. So the fact that the wizarding currency is relatively stable at the moment is basically just due to an accident. No one's done that deliberately. Also, no one in the wizarding world is carrying out arbitrage. So arbitrage is basically trading one currency for another for a profit. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is, in the wizarding world, you could take a gold galleon, melt it down into gold, sell that gold in the muggle world for cash. And then what you can do is you can go to Gringotts and you can trade that cash in for more gold galleons than when you started. So you basically just make money out of nowhere. And I checked, there are official exchange rates. There is an official exchange rate between cash and gold galleons that Gringotts offers. You can take advantage of that so easily. But no one's occurred to that. That's occurred to nobody, because nobody knows jack shit about economics. Also, no one in the wizarding world is stealing raw materials from the muggle economy. No one's doing it, because no one gives a fuck about muggle economy and muggle mining mechanisms. No one's thought to go to like a massive mine and negotiate all the machinery and negotiate all the mining infrastructure and all that just to nick gold and silver directly. So it comes from magical excavation, because it's just not occurred to anyone. And again, that irrationalism may sound like a crazy oversight, but it really does happen. And in fact, history is a testament of irrationalism. I mean, how many stupid fucking beliefs have humanity believed for centuries, purely because no one's thought to challenge these dogma? I mean, for example, if you look at the history of our conceptions of the world, so first of all, deducing the roundness of the world, deducing the heliocentrism of our universe, deducing other key truths about the world around us, it takes centuries. It takes time. It takes a long time for stuff that we would consider basic common sense to actually proliferate. So, anyway, wizarding currency, it's not pegged to any muggle currency. It's not even pegged to the muggle values of precious metals at all. And technically, the wizarding economy is capitalist. There are market forces. There are employers and employees. But the economy isn't planned or anything like that. So for more information on markets and central planning, you should check out episode 11 or episode 10 of Polymath, which all deal with what capitalism actually is. The railways of Wizarding Great Britain are nationalised, because there's only like one railway. It's just the Hogwarts Railway. It's the Hogwarts Express. So that is nationalised. That's operated by the Ministry of Magic. Portkeys, these magic Deus Ex Machina teleportation devices, they're not incorporated into any kind of public transport system. It's not national infrastructure. Private individuals create portkeys for private use. And there's lots and lots of property laws surrounding portkeys. Flu powder. So the flu network, the network of fireplaces, is nationalized. But true to the J.K. Rowling concession of Harry Potter, only one company produces flu powder. So in the original, so if you go on the Potter wiki actually, only one company makes flu powder. They've kept the price the same since like the 1600s, which I guess is testament to how small the forces of inflation are there, or it's testament to the fact that J.K. Rowling was not considering economic realities when creating Harry Potter. But that's the point. So broomsticks, they're manufactured privately. The government does buy them and redistribute them though. So there's no government factory, there's no government manufacturer of broomsticks, but they do buy broomsticks and they redistribute them to individuals who cannot afford broomsticks. There's no water industry, there's no infrastructure, there's no water piping, there's no elaborate series of pipes going from freshwater lakes to homes. So water is created by individuals using magic, and it's stored in however individuals choose to store it. They can store it by reservoirs, they can store it in little fountains, they can store it in aquifers, whatever. But there's no infrastructure because no one's thought to do this. There's no, if you can just create water on command using agrimente, no one does that. There may be like a few instances. So if people want to build a pool or something, then there may be some kind of, like a private individual could make a pipe if they fancied it, if they desired it. But in the economy, in society as a whole, it's just not a thing. There's no infrastructure like that. So agriculture and pastoralism, so the keeping of animals, it does exist, but it happens on very small scales, like back garden farms, carried out by individuals using magic to grow stuff. So small scale companies do engage in their own agricultural operations. So companies, for example, you could go to Diagon Alley and you could go to a store which sold food. So you could buy groceries, but these companies, they could be getting it locally, they could be making it themselves, they could be raising cows if they wanted to, but really the economy is run on requisitioned food from Muggle society. So if you're a wizard and you want to get fed and you're not growing your own food and you go to buy your own food, the company that you're buying that food from is probably just taking that from Muggle society. They may have like a garden growing certain herbs, but like they're not sustaining a business based on that model. My laptop's really low on charge. I'm just going to charge my laptop real quick. Hold on. All right, just plugged in the charger for the laptop. Do you think that feels good for the laptop? Do you think when the laptop gets charged, do you think it's going like, yeah, boy? You know, if it was like sentient, like if the laptop was sentient, would it like that? Would it enjoy that? I'm going fucking insane, man. I've been talking about this for like an hour and 50 minutes straight. We're not even done. We've got more stuff to do. But again, the government not involved in agriculture. So you can also take a non-manual magical manufacture. So a manufactured object that isn't magical. So for example, clothes. Mostly requisitioned from the Muggle economy. There are markets in non-magical goods, so you can buy clothes or like cauldrons or whatever. But it's quite small. And the domestic production of these goods is not sufficient to supply Wizarding Great Britain without any kind of Muggle requisition. So cauldrons, for example, when you buy a cauldron from Diagon Alley, they're not making it themselves in the backyard using a furnace. They're taking it from Muggle society. So the government in Wizarding Great Britain is by far the largest employer. It plays the largest role in Wizarding Great Britain's economy. There's very little private enterprise in Wizarding Great Britain. You've got Diagon Alley, you've got Nocturne Alley, you've got a few other streets. That's kind of it. There's not that many businesses. And these businesses are all small, family-based companies. Large corporations are completely absent. The largest company is by far Gringotts. So actually, yeah, Gringotts is, I guess, a large corporation, but they're the only exception. Most business is very, very small. So the government is the largest employer. It plays the largest role in the economy, although it plays that economic role mostly as an employer rather than a regulator. There's not that much government regulation on business, but it employs lots and lots of people. And the way the government gets money is through tax. But income tax and value-added tax don't exist. That tax comes through a property tax and land tax. So if you have loads of land, if you have loads of property, for example, a big house, that's what gets taxed. It's tax on that kind of stuff. It's not tax on what you earn. So trade with other wizarding societies is basically completely absent. So the economic policy of Wizarding Great Britain is protectionism. Tariffs are very high. So free trade between Wizarding Great Britain and other wizarding societies is essentially absent. So Wizarding Great Britain's economy is entirely based on self-sustenance. So it's based on what they can make themselves and based on requisition from the Muggle Great British economy. And the government can only afford to even function. The government can only be a government and employ so many people and do what it does, sustain on such a small base of taxes, basically due to the massive economic benefits of magic and the massive economic benefits of magical creatures. So for example, house elves provide a really cheap disposable labor force, Nifflers help excavate precious metals, or rather find precious metals. The entire wizarding economy is wholly dependent on the use of magic. So it's dependent on the use of magic, but it's also dependent on the Muggle economy, as I said, because food and goods production in Wizarding Great Britain is not high enough to maintain the population's standard of living and the population's size without relying on requisitions from the Muggle economy. So the state of the Muggle economy is very, very important. So in the 1950s and the 1960s, the Muggle economy was booming, it was doing very well. This period in Western history is known as the golden age of capitalism because capitalism was doing very well. Partly due to economic policy, partly due to the post-war economic boom that happened. So it's a mix of stuff that we could control and stuff that we couldn't control. But again, that's a topic for another episode. That's actually a topic for episode 11, I think, in Polymath. So you have this post-war economic boom, you have this high growth in the rate of Muggle worker productivity, and you have the high prevalence of manufacturing in Western Muggle economies. So in Muggle Britain, for example, lots of the Muggle economy in Britain in the 50s and the 60s was based on manufacturing. It was based on what we would call the secondary sector of the economy. So in economics, you have the primary sector of an economy, which is based on resources that you extract from the natural world. So farming, fishing, mining. You have the secondary sector of the economy, which is based on stuff that you make, so essentially manufacturing. And you have the tertiary sector of the economy, which is based on services you provide. So for example, and I mean, most jobs nowadays are about providing services. So if you get a part-time job, for example, at like a bar or at 3 or at a golf place or at a pizza place, I'm just listing the jobs of like my mates in my psychology course. That's all that's coming to mind at the moment. You can tell that I'm a student based on the jobs that I'm citing that my friends are doing. But anyway, these are all providing services. They're not making things. You're not working in a factory. There's also a quaternary sector of the economy, which is to do with data. There's extensions on this basic 3-sector division of the economy, but that's all we need to know for these purposes. So in the 50s and the 60s, the wizarding economy was doing pretty fine because if you want to requisition goods from Muggles, then loads of manufacturing is happening in Great Britain. So it's quite easy to requisition those manufacturers. But since the 1970s, the global Muggle economy has been in quite persistent difficulty. And that persistent difficulty is due to many, many causes. Again, partly deliberate economic policy, such as essentially, and again, I talk about this in episode 11 and also in episode 10 and also in episode 9 in Polymath, but the political and economic philosophy of neoliberalism, which has gained ascendancy in many Western countries since the 1970s, which favors economic deregulation and privatization and a move towards the economic right wing, so a move towards deregulation, essentially. So economic left is all about intervention in the economy, economic right is all about deregulation and non-intervention in the economy by the government, etc., etc. So the global Muggle economy has also been in persistent difficulty, both because of that and also because of globalization. So if you are a manufacturer in the West and you're suddenly competing with manufacturers in China because shipping technology has gone to the point where now it's actually cheaper to just pay some worker in China to make something for you and then ship that to the United Kingdom, your job is obviously going to be in jeopardy. So globalization and change in the global economy, and also, of course, the oil shocks of the 70s, are all things that have contributed to changes in the global Muggle economy since the 1970s. I think I'm going to do a separate episode on just how the global economy has changed since the 1970s and what's going on, and how that's led to a lot of the political phenomenon that we see around us nowadays. But that's really an episode for another time. But what's also important is that since the 70s, in the Western world, the share of manufacturing in Western economies, and indeed in high-income economies in general, so Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, etc., 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 has declined a lot. So nowadays, the economies of high-income nations, or rather developed nations, I should say, are post-industrial. So the largest sector in these economies is the tertiary sector. Now, if you're in Wizarding Great Britain, that's not great for you, because even though the absolute number of manufactured products in high-income Muggle economies has been rising, the number of wizards alive has also been rising due to population growth. So the idea that in the wizarding world, In the story that I've created, what's happening is that the average standard of living for wizards in high-income nations has been slowly declining. Because the only way that wizards can acquire manufactured goods, the only way that wizards really get stuff, is by taking it from Muggle society. But the population growth rate of wizards is exceeding the rate at which manufacturers in Muggle high income societies are increasing. So as a result of this discrepancy, you have this problem. You have this declining access relative to the size of the population of manufactured goods in wizarding societies, such as Wizarding Great Britain, so in high-income nations. So wizards in high-income nations could always trade with other wizarding societies, and in fact there is, in J.K. Rowling's conception of the Harry Potter universe, like a United Nations for wizards called the International Confederation of Wizards. So wizards in high-income nations could engage in trade in order to improve living standards. But wizards don't know shit about economics or trade. They see it as a Muggle subject, so they basically intentionally ignore it. They see it with contempt. So no one knows anything about how trade is actually coordinated between societies. There's no government bodies coordinating trade. There's no large infrastructure facilitating it. There's no like routes along which traders can travel. There's no places along which traders can meet. None of the infrastructure, both the physical and the institutional infrastructure for facilitating international trade exists because no one knows shit about trade in the wizarding world. So no one knows really so no one's really gone for a free trade policy. All these wizarding nation states have gone to protectionism, and also no one knows anything about the global Muggle economy. No one knows anything about globalization. No one knows anything about standard of living. So no one knows anything that's happening. No one even knows that the standard of living is declining in the wizarding world. They can just kind of sense that there's been a kind of vague economic malaise. So what's happening here, so what the conception that I have for this rewrite of Harry Potter is, just as we have this vague sense of economic malaise in the Western world nowadays, it's been going on for a few decades, we have this sense that the economy is going to shit. This is before 2020, by the way, when it started to explicitly go to shit. But we had this sense for a long time that things were getting worse, that unemployment was getting high, that real wages were starting to stagnate, that inflation was rising, even though no one in the West, most individuals in the Western world couldn't tell you about global economic changes. They could just kind of express this vague cognizance of economic malaise. So in the wizarding world, no one really knows anything about economics, so no one knows about unemployment or inflation. But that economic malaise is still felt by people because all these things manifest with societal changes. So in the Muggle world, if you have prolonged economic malaise, if you have rising economic inequality, if you have real wages stagnating for most people, if you have a trend of economic deregulation dating back to the 1970s, depriving many people of access to basic goods, that's going to be felt by people. That's going to lead to resentment. It's going to lead to anger. It's going to lead to confusion. It's going to lead to perceptions of threat. And all these things drive political polarization. It drives pessimism. It drives extremism. It drives people's vulnerability to demagogues. And that's exactly what we're seeing right now in the Western world with this sudden shift towards the right. The reason why populist authoritarian parties, more on what populism is in episode 16 of Polymath, by the way, the reason why all of these are simultaneously getting to power in the Western world is because the conditions for them to gain power are here. You have loads and loads of people who are disaffected, they are angry, they do sense that something's wrong, but most people don't know exactly what's wrong. Most people don't know about neoliberalism. Most people don't know about globalization. Most people don't know about the three-sector model of the economy. And as a result, it makes you very, very vulnerable to demagogues who provide a convenient scapegoat. For example, immigrants or feminists or LGBT or political correctness gone mad and all that stuff. That's really what's happening. And just as that's happening in the Western world, in my remake of Harry Potter, that's what's kind of starting to happen as well. It's not on the surface by the time the series starts, but it's bubbling under the surface. And as the series progresses, it gets more and more explicit. You have this prolonged economic malaise, but no one even knows what the fucking economy is, so no one's even able to tackle it at all. And that's leading to vague dissatisfaction here, that as the series progresses, starts to manifest itself in politics. And this is the world that Harry Potter enters when he reaches the age of 10. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is my rewrite of Harry Potter. Oh, sorry. That's not my rewrite of Harry Potter. That's going to be next episode. But that is what the Harry Potter world would actually be like if it were actually real. And this is a really, really long episode. I've been talking for a really, really long time. See, normally when I do episodes, a lot of the time actually, so in pretty much every episode since episode 7 now actually, I'll re-record sections of this video. So I'll re-record bits that I don't feel were good enough because I really want the quality of these videos to be as high as possible. So, I mean, there's probably been like hours of footage that I've just re-recorded over because I just didn't feel it was good enough. But this one, there was much less of that for this one. I really just belted it the fuck out. So clearly I've got a lot of shit to chat. I mean, I don't even really care. I'm not even that into Harry Potter. Like, it's not even that deep. But it's just, again, that intersect between the fantasy and the real. And the way that we can apply the real world and what's happening in the real world to fantasy worlds, that fascinates me. That really tickles me, ladies and gentlemen. I feel tickled right now. And I hope you feel tickled too. Intellectually tickled. Anyway, enough weird verbs. Weird verbs aside. You've made it to the end. You've made it to the end of a really, really long video. Unless you're just watching the clip at the end, in which case you've made it to the end of a clip, which I still appreciate, by the way. I still appreciate your time. I still appreciate that you've listened to all of that. And as always, if you're listening, I'm honoured. I'm genuinely really honoured that you'd listen. Thank you very, very much. And I hope that you have a lovely day, a lovely week, a lovely month, and in fact, ladies and gentlemen, a lovely year. Anyway, thank you very much. I've been Daniel Aaron Levy. My throat is sore. I'm going to go and eat some food because I really need it. I need to get some pasta in me. I need an egg. Yeah, I need an egg. I'm going to consume an egg. Guys, I'm going to go consume an egg. I hope that you're doing well. Maybe go and eat an egg as well. I think you've earned it. I think you've earned an egg. Anyway, have a lovely day and take care. Goodbye.